about. I mean, is it the fundamental problem that that continues to be and has been an inability amongst many people in Washington to accept the fact that Russia, despite its enormous diminution after the Cold War, remains a great power, that it is still, as it stands today, if not a great power, at least a major power, which is able to exert a very great deal of power in order to secure its immediate surroundings and its security and its territory. Because it seems to be that this is one of the fundamental problems in Britain, at least. We stopped taking the Russians seriously after a certain point. We stopped thinking of them as a major power any longer. We thought that they were just another country, you know, perhaps a bit more powerful than some, but not so powerful that it could effectively and successfully say no to whatever it was we wanted.
I think that's right on the money. I think that's correct. But let me put your comment in a broader context. I think that during the unipolar moment, the United States was clearly the most powerful state on the planet. It was far more powerful than China and Russia then than it is now, and every other country. And at the same time, we in the United States especially, but in the West more generally, have a very poor understanding of the limits of power. You can be extremely powerful, which the United States was, but there are limits to what you can do with that power. I learned this as a young boy / man when I was in the American military from 1965 to 1975, which was coterminous with the Vietnam War, right? So I was in that 10-year period when the Vietnam War took place. And I often said to myself over that period, how is it that the United States, which is one of the two most powerful states in the world, the Soviet Union being the other at the time, how is it the United States can't win this war against North Vietnam, which is a remarkably weak country compared to the United States? And the fact is that there are real limits to what you can do with military power. And we saw this again in Iraq and especially in Afghanistan. If you think about it, we were in Afghanistan for 20 years and we lost the war. The United States lost the war in Afghanistan. And nobody would argue that the Taliban can hold a candle to the United States. So I think it's very important to understand that there are just limits to what you can do with military power. In the West, that lesson was never learned. And given the fact that we were so powerful, we thought we could just slap people around. We could slap other countries around. We could tell them to jump, and their only question would be, how high? And that's not the way international politics works. And the end result is when you take your arguments about how we thought about Russia and you marry them to my argument about the lack of appreciation of the limits of power, you find yourself in the situation that we're in today.
I guess I heard you commented on this before, that you can make these mistakes. This is a curse of being a great power. You can, you can afford making mistakes because you can absorb the cost. But of course, after a while, this begins to snowball, and the problems will become too great. But I guess a key concern of mine is we don't seem very restrained anymore. I keep, for example, with these escalations now against Russia, we seem to dismiss it, that we can strike inside their territory. Well, what are they going to do? But we don't seem to appreciate that they also are faced with a dilemma. Yes, they don't want to start a direct war with NATO, but also if they don't respond, they might embolden NATO to escalate further. And I don't see much debate about this. I even feel sometimes in an Orwellian way, we reinvented our language to make it impossible to express dissent. I even saw you were here in Norway giving a speech, and it was say that, we can't give in to Russian nuclear blackmail. But we used to call this deterrence. But if we respect the deterrent of the adversary, that's blackmail now. And we have this kind of things where we have one language for us and one for them. So we can We can, we're allowed to, their side interfere in domestic affairs. We promote democracy. They do coups. We support democratic revolutions. They invade. We do humanitarian interventions. They violate sovereign, territorial integrity. We support self-determination. So we created this dual lingo now where we can't even compare with the adversaries. Do you see any problems going forward? The ability, I guess, security dilemma sensibility, recognizing the concerns, the legitimate concerns of Russia, that we don't stumble into something unforeseen.
Look, there's no question that we do not recognize the legitimate security concerns of the Russians. We just don't. The United States is filled with policymakers and pundits and strategists who are incapable of putting themselves in the shoes of the Russians. If I say to people that the Russians view NATO expansion as an existential threat, they will say it's not an existential threat. To which my response is, whether you think it's an existential threat is largely irrelevant. What matters is what they think, and they think it's an existential threat. And they'll go back to saying it's not an existential threat, and therefore the Russians shouldn't see it that way, and it's illegitimate, and so forth and so on. And then if you bring up arguments about the Monroe Doctrine and how the Americans would view this if, a country moved right up to America's borders, they just refuse to hear it. And there's a whole rhetoric, a whole discourse that they've invented, you were getting at this, that obscures what's really happening here. Just on the nuclear coercion point, I know the literature, the international relations literature on nuclear coercion. I believe there's not a single example in history since nuclear weapons were invented in 1945. There's not a single example of a country succeeding at nuclear coercion. And in fact, it's hardly ever even been tried, because coercion is where you threaten to use nuclear weapons to get someone to change their behavior. What Putin is doing is not nuclear coercion, it's nuclear deterrence, right? When he brandishes the nuclear sword in subtle ways, or his lieutenants do that in subtle ways, they're just trying to deter the West and deter Ukraine from crossing certain red lines. That's not coercion, right? But coercion has become part of the lexicon when we talk about the Russians. And there's this discourse out there that's suited for pursuing the policies, the foolish policies that we're now bound to, and arguing against that and changing the language is extremely difficult. There's just no getting around that.
I think you've put your finger on a very, very important thing, because I've come across this as well. People tell you, well, the Russians they don't have any reason to think that NATO is a danger to them. And then you say, but, they think that is what they believe. And there's an unwillingness to accept this. And it's unrealistic not to accept it, because that is the reality of what the Russians think. And you have to deal with those realities. And it's not a moral position to disregard realities, or an idealistic position to disregard realities. It is simply an unrealistic position to disregard realities. You're not being realistic in the way you conduct foreign policy if you conduct it in that way. And the result is the war that we see, and these devastating loss of life, and all these awful videos in which all of these people are killed, because we are not being realistic about what the Russians are concerned about. They are concerned about their security. They have historic reasons to be, and of course, they have particular reasons to be concerned about their security, given that we made various undertakings to them, or what they took to be undertakings to them at the end of the Cold War, which they feel that we didn't honor. So it's not surprising that they think that way. And they have a right to think that way, whether we think that they are right to think that way or otherwise. And it's a point which I've struggled to get.
At the right wing of the Republican Party opposed to NATO expansion. All sorts of people were opposed to NATO expansion. But the Russians were remarkably weak, as you both well remember, in the 1990s. So it was easy to make it happen. But at the same time, you really didn't need NATO expansion for security reasons because the Russians were not a threat. But of course, this has all gone to hell in a handbasket over time.
Because, of course, the other thing is that expanding NATO leads to commitments. If the other side does see it the other way and pushes back, which is exactly what they're doing in Ukraine now, then, of course, you might find yourself making commitments, or, well, not to Ukraine exactly, but you've made some kinds of commitments to Ukraine, commitments that you can't fulfill, and perhaps most dangerous for a country like Ukraine. It might have thought that it had been promised things and might have been led to do certain things in reliance upon those promises, which are going to put Ukraine, a country like Ukraine, in fact, Ukraine specifically, in an impossibly dangerous and difficult and disastrous situation. And Ukraine is being destroyed precisely because this policy of NATO expansion was pushed forward in the way that it was. Whatever the motivations of the people who were pushing it, the Ukrainians shaped their policies on that basis, and we now see what's happened to them.
What's very interesting is if you look at public opinion polls in Ukraine, going back to the April 2008 Bucharest summit, there was not that much enthusiasm for joining NATO inside of Ukraine. It was really in Poland where you saw, and in the Baltic states, a profound interest in getting into the alliance. And of course, you had lots of lobbying inside the United States during the 1990s and early 2000s to get those countries into the alliance. But Ukraine was not that keen on getting into the alliance. And even when they began to move down the road after 2008, public opinion in Ukraine was not that enthusiastic about joining the alliance. What really mattered was that Zelensky flipped on this issue in a big way in 2021. And that led, I think, in large part to the disaster that we face today.
And NATO actually has a document which came out in 2011, so the year after Yanukovych was elected. And it's an interesting document because it points out that, well, a key problem for NATO-Ukrainian relations is they can hardly find any polls which show that more than 20% of Ukrainians want to join NATO. And now that they also put their neutrality into the constitution and the government doesn't want it, the people doesn't want it, that this was seen as a huge obstacle. So it's again one of these narratives that the Ukrainians wanted to escape the clutches of the Russians and they were knocking on the door of NATO. It wasn't really the case though until the regime change of 2014. But I wanted to ask though, before we run out of time and lose you, do you have any predictions for where we're going with this? I mean, from how this war will end, territories lost, also NATO. Sorry, there's a lot of questions. I heard some people say NATO at least now is stronger than ever, but I've spoken to people like Colonel Douglas McGregor, who argues that no, actually it will be very weakened once the war is over and the Europeans will maybe feel duped. So I was just wondering how you read where we're going forward from here.
Well, it's somewhat difficult to say. I don't think there is any prospect of a meaningful peace agreement on the horizon. I think I'll be in the ground and there'll be no meaningful peace agreement. I think to have a meaningful peace agreement, getting back to our earlier discussion, Ukraine has to be a truly neutral country. And I don't think that's going to happen. I think we're going to remain joined at the hip with Ukraine for the foreseeable future. And that is going to poison relations for as far as the eye can see. So I don't foresee any, meaningful settlement of this crisis. It is possible that the war will be shut down and there'll be some sort of cold peace in the next year or two. I'm not sure, but there'll be the ever-present threat that it will start up again. And in that context, the Russians will be doing everything they can to weaken Ukraine and to weaken the West's commitment to Ukraine. And the West, of course, will be doing everything it can to weaken Russia. So I foresee a huge amount of trouble moving forward, even if the war is temporarily shut down and you have some sort of meaningful ceasefire. It's just hard for me to see how you end this, because I just don't think the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, is going to be willing to make Ukraine a truly neutral state and end its security relationship with Ukraine. So I'm very pessimistic about the future here. I think one cannot underestimate just what a foolish decision we made trying to bring Ukraine into NATO. It was a blunder of massive proportions, and how you shut this down, I just don't see how you do it. Maybe you guys have some ideas on what can be done, but I'm just remarkably pessimistic about this. And what I find so tragic about all of this is if there had been no decision to bring Ukraine into NATO in April 2008, Ukraine, I believe, would probably be intact today. Indeed, I think Crimea would be part of Ukraine today. There is no evidence that the Russians were interested in conquering territory in Ukraine. The idea that they wanted to pursue a greater Russia is a myth that we've created since the war started. The idea that this was some imperial power that was bent on reestablishing something along the lines of the Soviet Union is a laughable argument. There's no evidence to support that. In fact, one can argue that Putin, if anything, dragged his feet in terms of responding to the West, that he did everything possible to avoid a shooting war with the West. He understood it was not in Russia's interest to have a shooting war, but he couldn't get to first base with the West, which is another way of saying he couldn't get to first base with the Americans. On December 17th, 2021, the Russians sent a letter to NATO and to President Biden, demanding that some sort of arrangement be worked out where Ukraine would not be in NATO, where it would effectively be a neutral country. And he paid his letter hardly any attention. We just brushed him off. And of course, then got the war on February 24th, 2022. We were just unwilling to cut a deal of any sort. But anyway, I'm very pessimistic about where we are and where we're headed. And I'm just hoping that, this will be a case where I'm proved wrong. And somehow we, find a magical formula to put an end to this. But I just don't see it happening.